Good afternoon. I'm Łukasz Jurczyszyn, the head of the Polish Institute of International Affairs Brussels office. And I would like to welcome all of you, especially our honorable panelists, the members of the European Parliament, EU officials and experts, and our moderators will introduce them all later on in details during our panels. But for now, let me thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I would like to also thank our participants. We had more than 80 registered experts, EU officials, diplomats. We appreciate much your interest in our debate. And of course, I'm particularly grateful to Institut Montaigne, and most of all, its director of the Asia program, Mathieu Duchatel. This is our first common event on such a major theme for Europe, and I'm convinced that there should be much more Polish-French strategic discussions on EU major global Asian challenges. Not only towards China, but also in larger terms regarding Indo-Pacific region, for instance. So we have a beautiful team of Asia experts. So I think we are well equipped. I also must say that we had absolute pleasure to cooperate with such a professional team at Institut Montaigne. And today we will debate on the EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement. And we decided with our partners to deal with this subject at the two levels, political one in the first panel, and more technical and expert one in the second panel, which will invite us also to more general questions on how the agreement will impact not only EU-China overall relations, but how it will influence Europe's ties with the US. So finally, I'm giving the floor to Mathieu, who will give his introductory remarks, and then who will pass the floor to Director Dembski in order to kick off our first panel. I wish you all fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Łukasz, and a warm welcome from me as well on behalf of Institut Montaigne to all our panelists and our participants today. Just a few words of introduction. We like to call today's webinar more an online debate. We wanted to make sure that different views and sensibilities on the EU-China investment agreement would be given a platform so that they can have a discussion together. We designed the agenda to make sure that there would be enough time and space for interactions between the panelists and the registered participants. And you can see from the list of online participants that we have a very good group of experts, officials, and also executives from the corporate sector, people who know the agreement quite well and who know the politics around the agreement. In terms of what we will cover today, there is a lot of ground to cover, from technical to political aspects, as Łukasz said. And we have structured the debate around the idea of gains and losses, how gains and losses are distributed. This is a very simple analytical framework, which applies to the issue of how much market access Europe has gained in China, and also to the extent, to what extent the agreement is really leveling the EU-China playing field, which was the explicit goal from the European side, rebalancing, achieving some sort of a rebalancing in the EU-China investment relationship. But we think that the question is wider than that, and at the minimum that we have 4 issues to address today, which I will list very quickly: investment protection and the solidity of Chinese commitments to European companies in that regard, the question of norms convergence and what can realistically be expected from China on issues such as labor rights, carbon emissions, and corporate social responsibility. the political level, and especially the impact of the agreement on the EU-China political agenda going forward, but also on transatlantic relations. And finally, the prospects for parliamentary ratification of the agreement, which will be one of the topics addressed during the first session. To address these issues, as Lucas said, we have leading voices from the EU Parliament and EU think tanks, and we are grateful to all of you. But please let me highlight the presence today of Maria Martin-Pratt, because she has not only been on the front line of negotiating the agreement with China as the lead EU negotiator from the Commission, but she has also been always very much engaged with all stakeholders and also all analysts of the EU-China relationship. So we are particularly grateful to Maria for also accepting our invitation to join. Finally, I should echo what Lucas said, and this has really been an excellent cooperation with PISM and with the Brussels office. And I think that this is only the beginning for us at Institut Montaigne on all issues of European relevance. With the COVID-19 format, the online webinar COVID-19 format has many flaws, but it also allows for quick reactions. And I don't think we would have been able to get such a distinguished group of panelists together in less than a month to prepare before the pandemic. So many thanks indeed to PISM, to Lukasz, to your team. And without further delay, please let me turn virtually to Dr. Sławomir Debski, the director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, to chair the first part of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I have an enormous pleasure to chair the first panel of our online conference devoted to recent EU-China deal on investment, signed just 2 months ago in December, over Christmas time. Negotiations on comprehensive agreement on investment started in 2013. So it lasted almost 7 years. According to the mandate given to the European Commission in 2013, the main objectives of the agreement were to enhance protection of EU investment in China, improve access to the Chinese market and legal certainty regarding the treatment of EU investors, reduce investment barriers, and as a result, increase bilateral investment flows. At the summit in April 2019, the EU and China agreed that the talks would be, or should be, concluded by the end of 2020. However, in September last year, the President of the European Commission emphasized the lack of concession from China. The outcome of negotiations, which, as I said, were concluded in the end of December 2020, raised objections and provoked a heated debate among European, American, and Chinese, Indians, global experts. The EU member states also were divided over whether the deal improved the position of EU companies in China and the strengthening of EU's political position toward this country. So in this panel, we are going to raise all these questions and address them to our honorable speakers, members of the European Parliament. So let me welcome and introduce to you Anna Fotyga, a member of the European Parliament since 2014, Secretary General of European Conservatives and Reformist Party, former Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs. Madam Fotyga, thank you very much for being with us. Let me welcome and introduce Marie-Pierre Vedrin, a member of the European Parliament since 2019, European Democratic Party, Renew Europe, a Vice Chairman of the European Committee of International Trade, a French lawyer. Madame, thank you very much for being with us. And last but not least, I would like to welcome and introduce to you Reinhard Butinghofer, a member of the European Parliament since 2009, representing Greens, European Green Party, and co-chairman of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. All our distinguished speakers were very vocal on the deal which was signed. Ultimately, the European Parliament will decide whether this agreement will be ratified. And the politicians, members of European Parliament, are on board now because they should convince their voters, European public, about this deal. And ultimately, European public would be should ratify this agreement. So without further ado, after this, maybe a bit longer introduction to the subject, I would like to pass the floor to Marie-Pierre Vedrin and ask for her observations and her take, how we should read the agreement which was signed. Madame, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And first, I would like to thank you for your invitation. Thank you for the Institut Montaigne and for the Polish Institute of International Affairs for organizing this webinar on EU and China. I think it's a great opportunity to exchange together on this issue, because it's a very important issue, like you said. And for sure, you said that we are very vocal on this agreement, because of course this agreement concluded on December is an attempt from the EU to build a more reciprocal relation with China. And this objective doesn't mean to me that China is no longer a systematical rival. We have to go back to 2019 communication of the Commission. And China is not only described as a systematical rival, but also as an economic competitor and a strategic partner. And if China is an economic competitor with whom we try to have a more balanced relationship and could be a strategic partner in terms of fight against climate change, China is still a systematical rival in terms of model of governance and political system. So first, China remained a strong economic competitor. And the main goal of this agreement is to facilitate investment and rebalance our extremely asymmetrical trade relationship. So EU companies have a hard time getting access to Chinese markets, which is not the case for Chinese companies in the EU. So for me, the key word is ensuring more reciprocity. And thus main objective of this agreement is to secure the openness of Chinese market. And European companies should have more predictability in investing in China. And with the agreement, they should benefit from every new opening, which was not the case before. But the question is also, what is China gaining? Because the EU international market, as you know, is already quite open. And the European side has only considered greater opening of its markets on energy sector, notably renewable energy, which is, however, some safeguards. Our strategical sector will remain closed to foreign investment. And the crucial point, as it is for all our agreements, will be the implementation and the respect of such commitments. Because concluding an agreement is not the end of the process. It's just the starting point, in fact, because the implementation must be our focus, especially with China. And this is the case with the CAI agreements, because we know that China could avoid to respect any of its commitments. But it has to be the case for all the agreements. And if we see what is currently happening with Australia, this raised many concerns in terms of enforcement of the agreement. And if the intention of such an agreement is perfectly understandable, we will need to make sure that commitment will become reality. And there is another concern on my side. What are the concrete benefits for our companies? It is quite difficult to see what is the agreement we change for our company in China. And the European Commission has not given any concrete example yet. We need an impact assessment of this agreement. And as this agreement is also very limited in the scope, we perfectly understand why China will remain an economic competitor, especially in the European context of building our open strategic autonomy. So we are far too much dependent on Chinese products, as we have seen with the COVID crisis in the health sector, for instance. So indeed, I'm not convinced at all that while we are talking about relocalization of our industry in the European Union, planning a EU strategy for industry and SMEs, finalizing an agreement to facilitate EU investment in China is a good signal. So we should first facilitate the investment in our industry, in SMEs in Europe, more than in China. Second, for me, the real progress, and is still a minor one, is introduced by the CAI, is the fight against climate change dimension. This war, we should build a strong cooperation with China as a strategic partner. This agreement is not a free trade agreement, yet the Commission insists in included a trade and sustainable development chapter. And one of two dimensions included in the TSD chapter is interesting, the Chinese commitment to implement the Paris Agreement. So China, we know it's a world's largest carbon emitter, but at the same time, the largest investor in renewable energy. So without China, the Paris Agreement objective will not be reached. And it is the EU interest to continue to engage China to curb global greenhouse emissions. But the Chinese president has also announced that China strives to reach carbon neutrality before 2060. So at the same time, China is building and exporting the most coal-fired power in the world. So the inclusion in the CAI of clear commitment to implement the Paris Agreement and to fight against climate change and protect biodiversity is a good news. But as I already said, enforcement will be key. And China is taking strong declaratory position, but now we need concrete measures also on this topic. And another point on China remains a systematical rival, especially when it comes to values, because we cannot ignore the context of the conclusion of the CAI. The Hong Kong situation, Uyghur, Tibet, Taiwan, tension in the China Sea. So the EU needs to be a global player on this issue. And we need to be vocal and we need to promote our values. And so politically conclude an agreement will not make us silent. And at least the European Parliament, when it comes to human rights violation, that is the case with Hong Kong and with the Uyghur, we need to have a strong commitment on this issue. But we are not naive. We know that the CAI is too weak to introduce real change in China. It's not solved all the problem on this aspect. But we cannot say nothing. So with the CAI, however, China has only pledged to make continuous effort to sign or ratify ILO convention. But it's not really sufficient, especially on the forced labor. So for us, declaratory commitment is not enough. So it's why for the European Parliament, we need to have a strong commitment and to need new steps, not only the simply declaration. So it's why China must ratify this ILO convention and not only ratify, but implement them and put end to forced labor on its territory. So now we know that, like I said, the CAI is one tool, but we need more tools, and we have other tools. I'm therefore suggesting using existing tools. For example, the EU Magnitsky Act, to sanction those responsible of situation of the Uyghur and in Hong Kong, because we cannot compromise with our values. And we have also the EU foreign investment screening mechanism. We need to move forward on this mechanism also. We discuss a lot now about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It should be created as soon as possible to fight against unfair foreign competition. And I think that new instruments should be also adapted in order to ban the import of good products by forced labor and to ensure the traceability by ensuring due diligence from foreign companies. So I think so we have the possibility now to move forward, and the European Parliament has a key role. But furthermore, we have to open a broader debate on trade and sustainable development provision. Because indeed, in order to make this agreement and all free trade or investment agreements to become more acceptable, the TSD development provision must gain in enforceability. And maybe we must introduce a conditionality of hampering the international market. This is a point that I think crucial for the future of the EU trade policy. And I strongly believe that our partners should implement their commitment and face sanctions if they do not. So the ratification will not come before the beginning of next year. So now the European Parliament, we will play our role and to push China and to push also the European Commission to introduce new instruments and to have some real commitments about all these subjects. So, but in conclusion, just one thing, I think that the European Parliament are expecting a lot of things about this agreement, but also our trade review policy. Because I mentioned acceptability, I mentioned a lot of things, and now I think the EU must be coherent with its objective and values. So it's why, to conclude and to respond to your introduction, it's why we are very vocal, because I think that it's a good timing to push our partner, but to push also the European Commission.
Thank you very much, Marie-Pierre Vedrin, for this, for sharing with us your assessment where we are. Now I would like to pass the floor to Anna Fotyga and ask her about her reflections on this deal. The expectations are very high. We just heard that there are a long list of objectives that we expect this deal to somehow deal with. Is it feasible?
Well, if you ask me about prospects for ratification of within the European Parliament, I say that it is not quite clear. We just started the debate. I think that we are far from a deep assessment of the situation, although many of us are quite outspoken, as you rightly mentioned at the very beginning. Allow me one remark. Although I represent my political camp, the ruling coalition in Poland, in the European Parliament, in this case, and today in particular, I speak on my own behalf. It is because actually for quite a long time already, I've been involved in assessment of Chinese policies changing in both political scene in China and growing assertiveness of this country. And allow me to say that China of 2013 and China in 2021, they are totally different system. Actually, Xi Jinping launched the increasing of authoritarian posture of the country already some time ago, and I would say that it's quite well advanced. From this point of view, I think that very hasty concluding negotiations, in my opinion, open Xi Jinping will, because it was the effect of his assessment of eventual possibilities for more proximity in relations between US and EU after winning by Joe Biden. And actually this hasty approach of the EU, with all manifested earlier, I would say, endeavors to get closer because of Biden's victory, was just, I would say, kind of hypocrisy, because I think that whole West has certain reservations concerning behavior of China. In the European Parliament, I used to chair Subcommittee on Security and Defense all previous legislature, the 8th legislature, and my ambition was to show challenges to our common security wherever and whenever appearing. And actually, South East China Sea, South China Sea was quite frequently a topic of our deliberations, and also excellent French experts showing very disturbing situation there. So we have very, I would say, confusing picture, very, very disturbing, and a matter of concern for all of us in terms of security. I would like to remind you that China was part of exercises, military exercises, not only there in Indo-Pacific region, but also in Baltic exercises, parallel to famous Russian Zapat exercises. There is whole range of unbelievable atrocities in terms of human rights. It is not only forced labor. We had recent reports by BBC, for example, of whole system of rapes of people imprisoned in Xinjiang province, predominantly Uyghurs. There are other cases, and as my predecessor my colleague rightly mentioned, there is Australian case. And here I speak not as a human rights defender, because I am also involved in this issue. Probably it is my background. I started my professional career as head and as member and then head of Polish Solidarność Foreign Office under communist rule. So I know this situation. But allow me also to speak as person who has the background of foreign trade and also some experience in my first term in European Parliament of International Committee on International Trade as well. There is Australian case. In 2014, the bilateral agreement between PRC and Australia has been concluded. And what happened at the first attempt to undermine policies of PRC in terms of COVID-19 pandemic, lack of proper information, it was retaliatory measure introduced by PRC on Australia for political reasons. So striking the agreement, even improving conditions with this kind of authoritarian regime, not necessarily adds to credibility or to certainty of situation. It was around 200% of tariffs imposed, duty imposed on Australian wine and around 80 on Australian barley. And Australia has been and still is heavily dependent on exports to PRC. So what I'm afraid of is this agreement increasing our dependence. And rightly, we speak about this difficult angle of EU-US, or I would even go broader, EU-NATO cooperation that is extremely important in terms of security, because I think that the point of view of US on overall security issues and the type of systemic rivalry we face differs from European. And one more thing, I have long-standing experience of the EU relationship to China, to Russia. Actually, I've been delivering warning messages as early as 2004, probably, at the level of EU. I entered European Parliament at that time, then as foreign minister, and later on. There were variety of maneuvers trying to get closer, even over heads of whole of my region. I would mention Nord Stream 2, for example. And what happened? Now we have Borrell's visit to Moscow. Actually, total lack of cooperation on Russia on human rights issues, no instruments to push Russia, and overheads of whole region, once more delivering messages of warning, willing to engage with Russia on issues that are in Russia's interest, not necessarily in the EU interest in balancing our geopolitical position and projection of power there. So that is all. I'm open to debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Having heard views of representatives of Warsaw and Paris, there is a time for the third leg of the Weimar triangle. Now I would like to pass the floor to Reinhard Butinghofen from Greens, one of the most outspoken critics of the deal we are talking about. Reinhard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dembski. Thanks for organizing this discussion. I would be happy to be able to represent the German leg of the Weimar Triangle, but I'm afraid I'm only speaking so far for my political group. Obviously, no deal is ever 100% satisfactory for either side unless it's a capitulation. Still, I believe that the CAI deal has been greatly oversold in the public by Commission. It does have some pluses with regard to market access, even though some of the promises and openings are in a way recycled promises and recycled openings that would have fallen into our lap anyhow under the foreign investment law, for instance. But I'm not questioning that that may contribute somewhat to the business in some sectors. But overall, I would argue that indeed, and this has been alluded to by both my colleagues, the mandate under which this deal has been negotiated somehow is a leftover from a very different era in EU-China relations, the era prior to Xi Jinping's turn towards a more authoritarian and more aggressive China. Did we get legal certainty? Well, I think that's a very big question mark. Even though Commission has done a lot to negotiate provisions and new disciplines, everything rests in the final assessment on the conflict resolution mechanism, how strong that is. And let's just ask ourselves two questions. Would this deal protect us from the type of coercive pressure that is presently being applied to Australia? What would change in the coercive pressure that China applies to Sweden at the moment if CAI would be in force? I'm not so sure it would help. I believe that it's also important to note that we did not achieve the goal of reciprocity. Now, the overall criticism has so far focused mostly on two angles, and both angles reflect the big question marks that we have around Europe over whether we really want to follow through with the triad definition of the relationship to China: cooperation, competition, systemic rivalry. Is systemic rivalry really what we implement in all our relationships with China, that we realize pertains to all the dimensions of our relationship? We cannot compartmentalize and say, okay, systemic rivalry, that's for the human rights dialogue, and on trade and investment, that doesn't play a role. That may be the position of some leaders, but I don't think it's a valid point. And in that regard, I believe that two questions have been raised very justifiably. Does this reflect our values? And this applies in particular to the sustainability chapter and the part about ILO conventions. Commission has communicated publicly that the language included in the draft deal gives us leverage to, and I quote, eradicate forced labor in China. That's sorry, forgive me, that's just ridiculous. What we have is a very vague pledge. It amounts to not much more than just hot air, diplomatically packaged hot air. The second issue is the question, and this is also about systemic rivalry. Does this deal reflect our goal of reinvigorating the transatlantic cooperation on China? Let me say this clearly. This is not about asking Uncle Joe for his okay. We should have, however, given priority to the political signal that the transatlantic cooperation will be back. And instead, our leaders gave priority to the signal that we have to defend somehow the so-called European strategic autonomy against Washington. I think by doing that, we allowed Xi to show the incoming Biden administration the middle finger, and all of that after the year 2020, with all the Chinese atrocities, and in particular, Anna Fotyka has mentioned several of those. I think that was a deplorable political signal. But from my angle, criticism will go beyond those two primary critiques. And the third angle is about industrial policy and the industrial policy implications, the possible or the probable industrial policy implications of the deal. And when you listen closely to voices from the business sector, you hear that most of the reactions are not more than lukewarm. And I've spoken to leading figures in the German theater from the business community who have said, well, this is not what industry wanted. This is not what we needed. And I think there are several angles that we have to look into once we have all the information on the table, because as everybody knows, Commission is still to publish the annexes in particular. But one question that I would raise is about the national security exception in this deal. It is extremely sweeping. It's as sweeping as could get. So I would assume that any provision in this deal could be suspended unilaterally from the Chinese side by just saying, this is a national security issue for us. And there's probably not a single country in the world that has such an expansive definition of its own national security. Second, Commission has insisted, and I know that Maria Martin-Pratt has fought hard for that, to uphold our own right to regulate. But the right to regulate is not tantamount to the effective application of that right. And that depends not just on the will of the Commission, but also on the will of the member states. And I'll come back to that. Third question, how helpful is this deal going to be with regard to the necessary green transformation? There is language included on climate promises and climate goals, but that language is not very ambitious because the Chinese pledges in Paris were not very ambitious, and we clearly need more than that. And finally, there's also the issue of whether the industrial policy consequence play into the Chinese dual circulation strategy at the expense of European industrial policy. And I'll quote just one example from the automotive sector, where new investment into fossil energies are excluded in the deal, but a door is open to some degree for investment in new energy vehicles. Now that comes with strings attached. And those strings, to say it bluntly, would allow any halfway competent Chinese bureaucrat to decide that this investment in this province is not going to happen. With one exception, however, if the investment exceeds $1 billion, then the door is really open. Questions that I have in this regard are of very relevant, I would assume, consequence for European industrial policy. How will that affect the relationship between our major corporations, our MNCs, our OEMs, and the Mittelstand, the SMEs? Maybe this is an invitation to enter a Gulliver scheme, an invitation to put still more eggs into the Chinese basket, while being forced to integrate more deeply with the Chinese industrial ecosystem at the expense of our own supply chain. What consequence will that have? So finally, where are we going to go in the European Parliament? And as both colleagues said, it's too early to evaluate where the majority will be in the end. We have 1 year ahead of us, and I think we should insist on a very simple policy saying the autonomous measures that we would need to cover some of the deficiencies of this deal, like on the access to procurement through the international procurement instrument, or like a ban on the import of products of forced labor. These autonomous instruments have to be made use of before we are asked to ratify the deal. So I would say, let's insist on, as colleagues have already alluded to, the global human rights sanctions mechanism, the human rights due diligence legislation, IPI, anti-subsidy measures on the basis of the Commission's White Book from June last year, a ban on forced labor products, and possibly also an improvement on the investment screening. And thereafter, let's look at whether we really want to ratify still. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent overview of the political landscape in which the ratification process will proceed. We still have a couple of minutes during this panel, so I would like to ask a very simple question to you, or 1.5 question. First, as things stand today, would you vote for the approval of this deal as personal, individual members of the parliament? And second, should we use debate about this investment agreement with China as a point of departure for far more important discussion what the EU's strategy towards China should be, how it should like? Should we cooperate with the other partners of the free world to shape this such a strategy? What's your take on this? Maybe I will start in reverse order. So Reinhard would be the first one.
Okay, your first question is easy. At the moment, I would certainly not vote in favor. As I said, it will only be possible to really evaluate where we stand once we have made sure that we are taking the autonomous measures that would be needed. Second point, is this a point of departure for wider debate? It would have to be. I do not believe that this is reversing the decision by the European Commission and the External Action Service corroborated last October by the European Council and also supported from the European Parliament that we should devise our policy in this triad by this triad definition. However, I think that we're not united on that. If I look at this, and if I look in particular at the role that my own government played in the final phase of these negotiations, when frankly speaking, I know this is not polite, but I'm still saying this, the leadership was taken over by the Chancellor's office to pull this through against the opposition from other countries. I think we need to have a broader conversation.
Thank you very much. Anna Fotyga, please.
Thank you, Director. To first question, yes, my answer is also simple. Currently, at this stage, my answer would be to reject CAI, clearly without hesitation. Whether debate is needed and whether we have a chance to broader debate on, let's say, directions of the EU trade, eventually accompanying other policies. I would say that I count on this kind of debate. I was encouraged to large extent by President von der Leyen's statement about strategic compass and EU launching debate and attempts to define our position on our understanding actually of strategic autonomy of the EU. I must say that I'm personally very suspicious of this term, and actually I saw many times within debates or during debates in European Parliament that many of my colleagues understand strategic autonomy of the EU as something in between earlier US and Russia, and now most probably for some there is a strategic shift, or it may be strategic shift, and then it is placing us somehow in between US and PRC. Actually, I'm quite old-fashioned in understanding the West and our necessity to get closer, and that this bond is binding. And I think also that the streams of foreign trade should accompany main directions of security bond. So we have much to gain in deeper cooperation within the West, also in trade, innovation, in security matters, including defense industry. And we have to be very cautious in striking deeper contacts and deeper cooperation with systemic rivals.
So the same question to Marie-Pierre Vedrin.
Thank you. On your first question, the answer, like my colleague, is very simple. If I have to vote tomorrow, it's a no. It's a no because I have no answer of all my questions on the context and on the text. No answer on the European side and on the Chinese side. And on your second question, I think that, of course, we need to engage our partner, and we need to work with US, with Australia, with Canada, and also at in a bilateral aspect with our partner, but also at multilateral level. We have now a new Director General of World Trade Organization, and I think it's very important to work in this institution on China. And we need some real commitments on the CAI, but also on the global trade issue with China. So, of course, it's very important to work at international level, but to be coherent and to have a strong voice, we need more united Europe on this issue and what we want really with China, what kind of cooperation we want. So I think we need to work first at internal level at the European Union, what we want really, and of course to engage the discussion with our partner to work with a new cooperation.
Thank you very much. We have one question from the public, and as we have 5 minutes to end of this panel, we will probably manage to tackle this question from Charles Parton. And the question is, does it make sense to ratify the CAI in the absence of proper investment screening mechanism being set up in all EU countries? So maybe we'll start again from Marie-Pierre Vedrin.
Of course, I think that it's very important to move forward on the EU mechanism of screening investments, because like mentioned by the question, not all the countries have this type of mechanism. So I think it's very important that all the countries have this mechanism. And after we have a national mechanism, we need to strengthen the EU level mechanism because the mechanism, it's only information at this moment. So of course, it's very important to move on this issue also.
Thank you very much. Anna Maria Fotyga.
I'm not Anna Maria.
My daughter is Anna Maria, so that's only my
It was a joke. No problem. Yeah, it is a very, very important and valid question. Yet we have to know that screening is enough. We have a variety of levels of engagement of EU member states, although there are changes, there are new developments, yet I think that we have to engage in much deeper building of resilience on national, then on the EU and also NATO. We are NATO members, all three countries. I mean Poland, France, and Germany. And I think that NATO approach to resilience is very important as well on this issue.
Thank you very much. Rachel Butikofer.
Well, I think indeed that this should play a role in our conversation. The investment screening mechanism that we have in force at the moment that entered into force in October is a great achievement. And nobody knows that better than Maria Martin-Pratt, who negotiated it for Commission. But it had to be realized against three sources of opposition. One source was the fear from many member states of a new Brussels power grab. The second was opposition from dogmatic free marketeers. And the third was opposition from some countries that are maybe a little bit more beholden to Chinese interests. Against that opposition, it was indeed great to get what we have now, but it is certainly not sufficient, and we should develop that. I see a positive development in the fact that more countries are now creating their own national investment screening mechanisms, countries that would never have thought about it in the past, like Sweden. But we certainly have to improve. And I would add a second dimension. Not only should all the member states have their investment screening, but we should also find ways of cooperating on investment screening with the US and other like-minded countries who have strong mechanisms and of whom we can learn a lot.
Thank you very much. On this note, we have to end this first panel. I would like to thank members of European Parliament for being with us and sharing their reading of the situation and the deal and the political context. I appreciate also they forecast whether this deal has a chance to be ratified as things stand now in the European Parliament. So there are no good news for both the European Commission, which has negotiated this deal for years, and also for proponents of this agreement. Now, I would like to appreciate and express our appreciation to our honorable panelists. Thank them very much for their time and effort, particularly also their role as interpreters of this agreement for the public, as ultimately the public would need to agree on and accept what the Commission has delivered. Thank you very much for your time, for your effort, and being with us. Please stay with us during the second panel, which some of the questions which has been coming right now would be asked. I would like to pass the floor to Georgina Bright, the head of European Program Institute Montaigne. Meanwhile, we need some time for technical switching. Georgina is with us, so without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Slavomir. Hello and a very warm welcome to those who've just joined us. I'm Georgina Wright and I'm the head of the Europe programme at the Institut Montaigne in Paris. It really is a pleasure to be with all of you. So we've just had a really stimulating discussion on the many political implications of this deal. And now we were hoping to kind of turn to the deal itself. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by an incredibly distinguished panel. First, Maria Martin-Pratt, who is Director at DG Trade at the European Commission, and perhaps most importantly, although you will all know this already, Chief Negotiator of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment on China for the EU. We have Miguel Otero Iglesias, Senior Analyst at the Spanish think tank Royal Elcano Institute. Justina Studlik, Deputy Head of Research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and finally François Godemont, Senior Advisor for Asia and a colleague of mine at the Institut Montaigne. Thank you all very much for being here. So before we start, a very quick reminder that if you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the chat box and it will come in to me, and I will make sure that I ask as many as possible in the hour that we have left. And without further ado, let's get the discussion underway. So before we delve into what this will all mean for the EU and China and their bilateral relations, I thought it might be helpful to really kind of focus and remind our viewers and listeners of what is actually in the deal. So Maria, perhaps I could start with you first. The deal is the result of 7 years of negotiations, and you played a huge role in achieving that deal. What, in your view, are the greatest gains and benefits of this deal?
Thank you very much, Georgina. Can you hear me? Okay, and obviously I would like to start doing it very fast, thanking both the Polish Institute of International Affairs and l'Institut Montaigne for having me in this discussion. It's not the first time that I am in discussions, at least organized by the Institut Montaigne, and I've always appreciated very much the quality and the breadth of such discussions. Now, I have been responsible for a good part of the negotiations, not for the whole 7 years. And let me just say one point, because I heard the implications to the contrary in the prior discussions. These discussions were concluded politically because member states agreed to that, and all member states agreed to that. This was not a deal imposed by 1, 2, or 3 member states. This was discussed at the level of ambassadors in COREPER and then at the highest level, and there was the unanimous agreement from the member states to conclude the negotiations. I think this is important to clarify how the institutions work and the role that the member states play before the political conclusion of negotiations. Now, very briefly, as to the main gains of an agreement that I would like to also insist is specific, is tailor-made by design. We did not want to go beyond market access and facilitation of investment into China. We never wanted to, for instance, go into areas such as free movement of goods, free movement of persons, or including public procurement. It was tailor-made because of the difficulties and the realities in China, but also because economically, the reality is that we do have an important amount of companies and investors present in a market that potentially could be far more important, and that has been traditionally very close and very difficult. And that's the other element to keep in mind. It is not only that the European market is far more open than China, that's a reality de facto, but from a legal international point of view, we still have far greater commitments in terms of market access for Chinese investors than China has vis-a-vis Europe. And this is basically the result of the current situation in the WTO. When China did negotiate to enter the WTO in 2001, the emphasis at the time, reflecting as well the type of economy that China was on goods. So if you look at the commitments China took vis-a-vis us and the rest of the WTO membership, they were very, very limited as opposed to the reality of our commitments in the WTO, which are vis-a-vis China and the rest of the members quite ambitious in the area of services, including investment for services. So that was the starting point. That's why we said from the beginning, this is a tool to rebalance market access, not to achieve full reciprocity. That can be a misleading term. It was to rebalance. That is why in the negotiations, and we were successful in that, we were asking China to move far more in terms of opening and committing markets that we were ready to do. And that's why our offer remained relatively modest. Second, an important general point, this is a target tool that is one more tool within a larger and more complex, sophisticated strategy. And that I think is very, very important. It wouldn't be realistic to think that via an investment agreement, not even via a free trade agreement, you can address all the challenges that a geopolitical and economic reality as China put to us. And this is something that the Commission has had very clearly from the start. But at the same time, and this is something where we might have different views, at least with some of the participants, we do believe there is a value in rules-based trade and engaging with China on the basis of rules. This is very important. Again, China is too big, geopolitically and politically and economically, to imagine that we can just influence or we can live on the same planet as China by not having rules with them, by just having autonomous measures. We have an economic relation with that country, which is a reality, and it is far more important for us than maybe for others to be able to trade or invest on the basis of rules. You may not have the trust you need. You may need instruments to ensure the enforcement of commitments, but the rules continue from the point of view of the European Union to be an important part of an overall strategy with China. We do not believe in full decoupling. We don't believe it will be in our interest not to have rules in our relations, economic relations with China. The main benefits, I can go very, very quickly, and they are all WTO pluses. In terms of market access, what we have done is, first of all, we have bound and ratchet all the openings in terms of market access in the services sector that China has been unilaterally doing in the last 20 years. It is true, they were doing them, but in the same manner that they were doing them unilaterally, they could undo them very quickly because they were not bound in any international treaty. They are bound and ratchet, meaning future improvements will also have to be granted to European investors in CAI. And as far as services are concerned, these are to be recognized on a MFN basis to the other WTO members. So in that respect, this is not only for the benefit of European investors, but also other WTO member investors. It literally lifts the floor of commitments of China in GATS by catching the last 20 years. We do have as well specific new openings in specific services sectors. We're talking there about telecommunications, very important, health, for instance, services like computer reservation systems, which are related to all the, with aviation services. And there are also commitments in area of manufacturing, which is non-services, in particular as regards the manufacturing of cars, but generally China, and this is also beyond GATS because non-services are not covered by GATS. China has also committed market access and non-discrimination for manufacturing. The level playing field, and I'm not going to be able to get into much detail, but it is important for me just to highlight, we do have provisions that try to facilitate, address many of the problems that our investors face, not to access as such, not to be authorized as such, to try to get into an economic activity in China, but rather to actively engage, to effectively be able to conduct their businesses. And these are beyond the borders, if you want, barriers that come in the form of discriminations as to requirements that they need to fulfill to be able to obtain an authorization, not possibility to participate in the standard setting bodies, rules that openly or in a not so open manner try to force a transfer of technology, discrimination from state-owned enterprises, which, as you know, play a very important role in the Chinese economy. There is a whole panoply of rules that are very much tailor-made for the China reality and try to address many of these problems. Are they perfect? Are they in full everything we need? No. Are they a substantial improvement as from where we started, which was having very little or nothing? Yes, they are a very important improvement in that sense. In particular, if we combine it, and I'll go back to that in half a second, to the possibility to enforce the obligations. But the last part, before getting the other, I want to highlight sustainable development. And again, I'm happy to get into details in the debate. There is no other trading partner that has been ready to inject sustainability, both as regards climate and environment and as regards labor and conventions such as the ILO conventions. There's been no other partner ready to have that discussion with China. And I think this is important. We do need other instruments, including autonomous instruments, but we also want to have, for instance, ILO being able to have a role to play if China ratifies, as it has committed to do, the conventions of the ILO that are related to forced labor. And you can look into the RCEP agreement concluded in November, and not that far from CAI, and including great democracies, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Japan, or South Korea. You can look into the Phase 1 agreement that the United States concluded a year ago with China. You can look into the agreements that are being negotiated by Norway, or that have been just renegotiated by New Zealand. You will not find sustainability. And in that respect, what the European investment policy and trade policy brings it is those values that for us are part and parcel of our economic policies. We can discuss whether you think they are strong enough or not. What I can refute from the start is to say this is just an intention, this has no value. And anyone that has a doubt doesn't need to believe my words. Do please, is public, read the recently published panel on a dispute between the European Union and South Korea on the basis of our free trade agreement that contains very similar obligations. And I'm happy to discuss that in detail, but do please read that before stating that the obligations in CAI on sustainable development and labor more specifically don't exist. Finally, we have state-to-state dispute resolution, and we are the European Union. I'm not going to take a position as to whether others can or cannot, but what I know is that it's very clear in our trade policy, we are increasingly shifting resources and efforts from negotiation to implementation, and we are absolutely convinced of the need to make sure that we enforce the obligations we have agreed with China. Otherwise, I fully agree with anyone that will say there is no value in what we have in this paper. But we do have a state-to-state dispute resolution with a possibility to retaliate. Happy to enter into differences for sustainable development, but I think it is important to keep that in mind. And also important to see that we now have an institutional framework, which includes an obligation to discuss at the highest level that we have ever set in a free trade agreement or an investment agreement. It goes all the way up to vice premier for the Chinese system. This is very important. We do have a structure that will allow us to discuss a number of things that without the CAI we will not have the possibility to discuss with China unless they graciously decide to, and to have disputes with China if we need to, and if need to, take measures in case China does not comply with the obligations it has undertaken. So I think while at the same time insisting this is part of a broader strategy that includes the autonomous measures that have been referred to before, and that I think are extremely important for the credibility of our overall policy vis-a-vis China, and we've been careful to keep the space we need for those autonomous measures. This is one instrument that does not take away, rather in our view, can be used to work with others, with the United States, with Japan, in a bilateral or trilateral context, in a plurilateral or in the WTO. All these are parts of our overall strategy, and CAI is a piece that fits within that strategy. But again, I think it's very clear from the Commission point of view, in terms of the content of CAI, we think there is value, market access, level playing field, and sustainable development. Then we will have a broader discussion, which is a political one, which is the one the European Parliament will have. Anyways, we still have a number of months and quite a lot of work to do in front of us.
Marie, thank you so much for that incredibly insightful overview, and for kind of reminding, I guess, this idea that this isn't just a standalone agreement, that actually it is part of a bigger strategy. And that comes back, there was some discussion earlier on in the chat about, you know, how can the EU and the US still work together against China? Well, this is a proof that actually this is a starting point, but this isn't the whole of the EU's approach towards China. There's a lot more going on. And, you know, having covered Brexit for 4 years, level playing field is music to my ears. So I'm very glad you brought that up as well. Just a reminder, if you do have questions or you want to make comments, do put them in the chat. We will make sure we read them. But Miguel, maybe I can turn to you now. You know, are very interested in international political economy. You're also a China expert. I guess, you know, having listened to Maria and the previous speakers, what in your view are the sort of economic implications of this deal? And in particular, what are the opportunities that will arise for EU businesses?
Thanks, Georgina, and thanks to PISM and to the Institute Montaigne for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I have, I think, 6 minutes, so 6 points. First point, unless Europe changes radically its growth model, which would be much more kind of, you know, consumption investment led here in Europe, and we continue with an export-led model in most countries, and in some countries like mine, increasingly as well, focusing on export. Member states will continue to fall over themselves to be in China. You know, the Chinese economy over the past 5-6 years has contributed 30 to 40% of global GDP growth annually, and therefore, you know, that's a big market. Presumably will be a bigger market in the future, and the scale of dynamism of China makes a lot of businesses wanting to be there, and not being there would be almost like in the 19th century not wanting to be in the United States, right? I mean, you know, so there's a big urge to be there. Second point, I don't buy what I hear from many people that this is just a German or French German push to you know, to achieve an agreement with China. You know, the European Union is much more than France and Germany. There are many companies, not only the big companies, but a lot of companies from Sweden to Spain, including Greece, that want to have businesses with China, want to invest there, or want China to invest in Europe. So they are keen in having good investment relations with China. And this is the reason why, despite all the noise and the critiques and the criticisms, as Maria just mentioned, no state has opposed to this. You know, they might be hiding behind the French and the Germans, or the Germans, but all member states have a keen interest in agreeing on this and in being in China. So I think that's my second point. Then I think the point as well that Maria just mentioned, I think that has not really been discussed enough, is that this locks in a lot of the openings that China has done over the past 20 years. And I think this is important. In a moment where I think, you know, and this goes by what Reinhard said, perhaps right now in Europe, you have two types of people, right? Those that think, look, this is not the best timing to do a deal with China because of Hong Kong, because of Xinjiang, because of, Taiwan, the list is long. And so, no, we cannot give this supposed gift to China. And those that think, and I'm in this camp, that think, look, precisely now where China has obviously become authoritarian on the political sphere, precisely now you need to actually lock in some of the openness of China so that China doesn't backslide. And I think that's an important point. Fourth, look, there have been some openings in certain markets, but we need to see the annexes of the agreement. But in certain areas, there is the movement, electric cars, of course, health, some consultancies, some telecommunications. You could maybe ask for more, sure, but you can get what you can get. Once you have certain concessions, what do? You say, no, the timing I don't like, and these concessions are not enough. Or do you say, well, actually, they have conceded quite a lot that we have pushed for, and the timing might not be bad either because things might be messy with the new Biden administration, etc. So let's lock this in. Let's pack this in. And that, I think, it's what happened. So is issues, I think, I talk to a lot of businesses. Look, Spanish businesses that are in the car manufacturing sector, they're happy. They know that their parts, they do parts for the German cars, so they will have more business in China, and they're pushing for this. They're happy, and so again, this is just my point of this is, what is first good for Germany might be good for, for example, for Spanish businesses, for businesses in, Central Eastern Europe that are, in the value chains of Germany. Secondly, what is good for the big businesses, to Reinhard's point, sometimes, it's good as well for the smaller, these are smaller companies that actually are plugged in the big companies that are in China. Fifth point, look, I think everyone that has looked at China, the Chinese capitalist system, the state capitalist system of China knows perfectly well that, and I think it was, Marie-Pierre who said at the beginning, look, this is the start of the negotiations, and everyone that has done work and business in China knows that signing the agreement, signing a contract is only the start of the negotiations, because that's how the Chinese operate, in the sense of, okay, we got to enough trust to sign this. Now we sign it, and now we will start to see what we can do together. And so I think we should see this from this point of view. That has some problematic implications. What have been the side deals of this? Apparently there were side deals. We don't know which ones there were. And of course, it means as well that China can open up more than it signs, but it can as well close down more than it signs too. That's the Chinese system that is based on kind of this contingencies and this level of kind of leeway and room of maneuver in terms of how things are done. Not everything that is on the paper is fulfilled completely, and there is of course always room for political maneuvering. And the last point is, look, I think this is a better deal than the phase one. It's more ambitious on many fronts. Maria just pointed to some. Even people like James Andrew Lewis from the CSIS said, look, that this tries really to bring more transparency to the China's state-owned enterprises and to the public investments and subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we can discuss whether this might happen, whether it's enforceable, whether it will be implemented. But again, I'm with Maria. I mean, what now? We don't believe in rules anymore. We don't want to have rules with China, and so we just deal with it without really kind of having some sort of, legal framework. I think it's better to have a legal framework. and push China on the things that they might not do it, but at least they have signed something, right? And so that's very important. And ultimately, based as well on the Chinese system, it is we have now a high level dialogue at the vice premier level on a regular basis. From a Chinese perspective and how you deal with China, that's the way that you actually get deals done, and that you can maybe protect some of your investments if it comes to it. And look, more transparency on all this front will as well help us in a possible negotiation of the WTO, where these issues about opening the black box of China's state-owned enterprises will come up, and everything we achieve on a bilateral level will be helpful at the WTO level, and therefore it is all in the wider strategy of the United States and the European Union to open up more the Chinese market. And I leave it there.
Thank you very much for going. Again, a really great, clear 6 points. And I like that you touched both on sort of some of the economic opportunities for businesses, not only German and French businesses, but very much businesses across the EU, but also the political opportunities, perhaps in dialogue between the EU and China, and of course in the EU's position within the WTO, and any kind of discussions around state subsidies and stuff like that, because of course that is a very important discussion happening right now in the WTO. And I know Francois will have a lot of thoughts on that. But before I turn to Francois, I would like to turn to you, Justina. You spent a lot of time looking at China in China and also in the EU. And I was really wondering if you could pick up maybe where Miguel left off, which is, what are the political implications of this agreement, do you think, for EU-China relations? How have member states responded? And how, if you had time, has the deal gone down in China? Because we don't always hear that aspect either.
Thank you very much, Georgina. I do hope that you hear me, that everything's okay with my internet connection. And to be honest, I belong to the camp which is pretty critical about CAI. And to be frank, I do not agree with Miguel that because I think that still the economic gains for the EU companies are dubious. We are still waiting for the publication of the annexes, but also I think that is problem with some Chinese promises about. So let's look about and wait for the implementation of the promises when it comes to the level playing field. By going back to the question from Georgina about the implications of CAI for EU-China relations, firstly, a few words about the responses from the member states. I know that all the member states agreed to cast the deal, but of course, before the finalization of negotiations, there were many, let's say, rumors about it, and I think that this acceleration of talks was really unexpected, and there were several. We may say that there were visible divisions between EU institutions, mostly the Commission and the European Parliament, but also member states. And if we would like to look at some concerns about the CAI, we can focus on 4 points, 4 concerns. The first one is about the validity of the negotiation mandate. It was mentioned in the first session because it was the Commission received a mandate 7 years ago, and of course this is right now is completely different situation both in the EU and China. We have Xi Jinping. It was just before the Xi Jinping at the beginning of his term. Of course, the process of the last weeks of the negotiations were not very transparent to the member states. Poland, also Italy, unveiled that it was very difficult to have access to the deal, to the content. Only member states were briefed very generally by the Commission about the content. So it was a problem. Of course, the doubts if we should conclude the talks before Biden's sworn as a president, because we as a EU offered and initiate consultation on transatlantic consultation on China, and the meeting was launched the dialogue was launched on October. And of course, it was problems if we should give China political victory in 2020, which was marked by warfare, diplomacy, disinformation campaigns, of course, the deteriorating situation in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. And of course, there's a question because there are many doubts within the member states, but eventually there is no, the member state could not, let's say, create a coalition against the deal. So it leads us to the role of Germany, I think, and the fact that at the end of the day, it is the fact that the Franco-German tandem is very, let's say, powerful. And now I will go to the next the second question that Georgia asked me about the let's say Chinese point of view. And I think that looking at the implications and trying to know what's the implication of CAI for EU-China relations, it's really we must look at what China is talking about CAI. And it is really, really interesting when you read what Chinese experts and journalists are saying or writing. It's obvious that China is really aware of its own diplomatic upper hand, diplomatic victory when it comes to CAI. And it is the third, let's say, example of victory, China's victory, because the first one is one-phase deal, the second one is RCEP, and the third one is CAI. And what is really interesting when we're looking at what China is saying about CAI is that it is a kind of a confirmation. CAI is a kind of a confirmation what China thinks about EU, how China perceives the EU. And in that sense, EU is not a strong, cohesive, and united and influential political entity that can effectively pursue its political agenda and promote values and norms. And this kind of, let's say, divisions within the EU institutions, but also member states, is a kind of a confirmation. And by concluding CAI, EU undermined to some extent its hard stance on China that was officially announced in 2019 by EU-China Strategic Outlook. And it worked very well, I think, in recent years and months. What is from Chinese side interesting that it is said that deal shows that the important role is played by Germany. So it is a confirmation that China is right to focus on Germany and to give Germany let's say some benefits, because focusing on like automotive market and so on. And to be honest, in my understanding, what China tries to do is to make to preserve the overdependence, Germany's overdependence on Chinese market. It is also said that member states are focusing on economic interests rather than hurting China without considering potential cost. And what else? China says that CAI means that EU is taking sides, and in that sense, that EU decided to choose China as a Chinese let's say rhetoric. And the last 2 or 3 points is that CAI confirmed that strategic autonomy is still valid even after the victory of Biden. And strategic autonomy is perceived in China, of course, as the EU being autonomous from the US. And this kind of perception, this kind of notion, China really supports. And the last 2 points that China says that CAI is let's say a victory over the US as a result of the strategic autonomy, and it is said that that Washington attempts to intervene and stop or block the negotiations in the final stage, and it ended up with a failure. And now it is expectations that the United States would like to intervene in the EU to prevent from, let's say, signing and ratification. And in that sense, China is, let's say, hoping that the EU will stick to the strategic autonomy notion, and this, let's say, possibility of transatlantic cooperation on China will be reduced. So thank you. I stop here and wait for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justina. And we've had quite a few comments and questions about the transatlantic relationship, and which we will definitely come back to. But before we do, I did want to pass the floor to Francois. You were one of the very first actually experts to publish your take on this agreement. And you've also spent a lot of time thinking about multilateralism, when China fits and all of that. You know, what difference does this deal really make to China-EU relations? What, in your view, was left out, and perhaps conveniently so? And then if you did have time, how could you sort of touch maybe on how this landed in the US, building on what Justina just said, and how this might impact EU-US relations on China?
I'll try to do that, not coming back indeed to the policy note I wrote, which is the same title as the first roundtable we just had. So I'm not going to launch into an expose of that note. To answer the first part of your question, this is highly political. We have had, in fact, throughout those two roundtables, a debate on whether the glass is half full or half empty. And I think many of the people who spoke about that said, well, it doesn't really matter, you know, it might be quite empty, but it's already something to say that we intend to fill it. And that is the main political gain that China is making. In the last few years, it has become afraid of economic decoupling, some forms of economic decoupling, which go from tech denial, export denials, to a more fundamental issue of becoming indeed more autonomous in our industrial policies and strategies. And with this agreement, it is at least getting a commitment. Maria Martin-Pratt, with due respect to her, she's a very competent negotiator and a very willing debater, which is so rare, you know, the combination of the two. But she said, we are against economic decoupling. And it's true that Europeans, businesses, and that some European governments are against economic decoupling. But that's the only thing that motivated China to move at the end of 2020. I can understand the viewpoint of people who tried in vain to negotiate an investment agreement for 7 years, and suddenly over Christmas, the Chinese come bearing gifts. And the gifts have a time limit that we set ourselves. We wanted the agreement before the end of 2020. We had said it 2 years ago. And so Europe lets in, Europe gives in to what is a very limited agreement with some gains. I'm not going to go into the detail of the small gains. They exist. Many of them are formal rather than concrete. On and on, speakers, even speakers for the agreement, have agreed that it's going to be very difficult to enforce and that we don't know if this will turn real, but it's at least a good thing that it's laid on paper. Well, for the last 5 years, since the market economy status debate, the EU had turned to a new philosophy of its relations with China that A, you do not take its word for granted. B, you look for deadlines and verifications. And C, indeed, you begin to establish your own autonomous measures, and you call it systemic rivalry, which is a rhetorical word, just like reciprocity, but pretty much describes the fact that you cannot rely on integration and interdependence with China. We've heard today stuff that confirms, in fact, our fears. When Miguel explains, look, the Chinese could do worse. In essence, they could sanction us, and even sanction us economically, and our businesses are afraid of that. So they are glad that there is some kind of floor that's established through an agreement. It's pretty revealing, because that indeed is what is happening in China. The economic ground is shifting in many ways. The drive to innovation, self-sufficiency, so-called circular economy, is very big. And many firms, including the top multinationals which are present in China, know that they might have an expiration date on their investments in China. I think just from that point of view, we are missing what is the main historical trend in China today under Xi Jinping. Second argument, and I turn again to Maria, whose defense was, competent, concrete, and also spirited. But there's one word she never uttered throughout her expose, which is values. She made it up in part by talking a little about forced labor, and again, we have a commitment. We might get there. It might help. Nobody else got the Chinese to even utter the words, shall we say? But values is the mainstay of the new European trade diplomacy, the so-called new type agreements. And indeed, there's a history, and DG Trade is very good at it. It's got agreements signed with Japan, with Korea, with Vietnam, it's with Singapore before that. And as they go, these agreements get more commitments. But let me tell you, it's a different thing to get enforcement from China. Maria has cited the current labor dispute arbitration on labor issues with South Korea, because there has been indeed a text published. But if you look at it, Maria, my belief is yes, it says in essence, the South Koreans, yeah, so sorry, we didn't fulfill, we're not doing this right, but there's no sanction, there's no enforcement. And this is with South Korea, which is of course an easier, I'm not saying the Koreans are easy in every trade aspect that you face, that would be an exaggeration, but they don't have the staying power of China. You got from Vietnam, for example, in between the political agreement and the signing of the deal, you got China to amend its labor laws, its labor code. You got Vietnam, yes, to amend the labor code. It would be absolutely fantastic, as several MEPs have suggested, if you could get China to commitments on the right of unionization, on the right of bargaining, and of course, on forced labor. My guess is you're never going to get from China what you got from Vietnam, which is a much weaker partner, even if the authoritarian system has some similarity with China's. I think I'm not going to go very far in this direction, but I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we show our strengths to China by agreeing with this deal. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that what's happening in China is a kind of fleeting temporary moment, that it's, maybe due to one leader at the top, and it could change, and we have to wait for better times and to lock in concessions. The reality is that China is moving forward, is strong, as Miguel and others said, and is going to be more and more able to escape the consequences of not enforcing agreements. It's given ample proof of that last year, and so many issues that it would take too much time to list them all. But it's very clear that the EU decided at the end of 2020, in the short 2 months when there was a total void in Washington, by the way, given the mess after the presidential election and before the inauguration, is it a sign of strength that we're giving, that we sign, that we have a political agreement at that time, or is it interpreted as a sign of weakness? I think there is a reality check which should be done with a parallel with the situation with Russia, where not at the trade level, at the external policy level, we have this mantra that we need to engage, and as the situation deteriorates, we need to come even more and talk, and you can see the result. Let's not take these partners for standard partners in a world that would shift back to integration, globalization, and common rules, and even less common values, which they absolutely turned down today. I will grant all partisans of the CAI one issue, which is we don't really know what the politics of the Biden administration on China are going to be. Some of us have been pleasantly surprised to find in the administration people who hold pretty realist views and long-standing views and who are knowledgeable, but there is a past record at the top of more engagement than anything else. The change is relatively recent, and there is this, just like we heard Miguel utter the interest of business, even when it's riding on, shall we say, on German cars, which could be true of Eastern Europe, by the way, also. There's a lot of subcontracting going on, stuff that goes to China or is produced in China. We could have a predominant economic interest, domestic economic interest. I think the debate is still going on in Washington. It's not solved. I think the first weeks are not indicative yet of what will happen in the next year. But I think if we were to give a sign to the Biden administration, to the strategists, to the trade and investment negotiators, that Europe is on the whole somewhat opportunistic, not totally reliable, and likely to part ways, and therefore to push the US to fend for itself and not really pursue the kind of transatlantic coordination that by now we need. And we don't need it because we are idealists of the transatlantic coordination. We need it because China is getting stronger, quite simply, on the economic front and on other fronts. I think we would have given them that pretext to shift the administration's policies and politics towards, shall we say, another phase of America first, or relying possibly on other partners rather than Europe. I know that right now there are efforts going on in the other direction. I'm just pointing out, and nothing is final. The CAI is not the final action. I agree 100% with the notion that there are other steps that can and should be taken by the EU. But since you asked a political question, Georgina, I would end by saying I fear that the CAI and all the pressure that will build up to justify signature, ratification, to get the Chinese also to sign on the dotted line, including the fine print. All of that is largely to distract politically Europeans from the other measures that they need to take in view of China's policies and in views of its economic ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois, for that, and actually ticking off a lot of my own questions that I had on my list. We've got sort of, I'm going to say 10, 12 minutes for Q&A. We've had a lot of interesting comments and also questions. I will turn to Maria first for a very detailed question, particularly on aspects of the CAI and how that might impact US-EU cooperation. But before I do, I just wanted to read a comment by Charles Parton, who said, you know, and it's true, we haven't really mentioned the UK here, but he said, you know, one of the sort of consequences of this deal is perhaps that it sets a floor if you're an optimist, or a ceiling if you're a pessimist, on what the UK might be able to negotiate on China, with China on investment eventually. And it will be interesting to follow that discussion as well, particularly given the very heated political discussion on China in the UK. But Maria, I'll turn to you first. A question here from Audrey Winter, who says, you know, both the US and the EU have said that they want to cooperate on China, but some of the general obligations in the CAI, so for example, non-discrimination and performance requirements, prevent the EU perhaps from imposing additional restrictions on inbound investment on Chinese investment. That's question one. Whereas if you contrast that with the US phase one, there seems to be more flexibility because they can grant unilateral obligations on China. Won't this particular aspect make EU-US cooperation more difficult on China?
Okay, you hear me, right? I did not hear the very beginning of the question. The sound was a bit flickery, but I think I got the main thrust of the question, which seems to be: have we now, because of the commitments taken in CAI, reduced the space we have for our, let's call them autonomous measures, whether they are measures that have already been adopted, like the regulation on the foreign direct investment screening, or the 5G toolbox, or the export control regulation, or instruments that are in the making, such as a possible instrument to address the distortive effect of subsidies in the European internal market? And the reply is very clear, is no, we have not. We are extremely careful, not only when negotiating with China, when we negotiate with any other partner and within the WTO as well, we do rely on the space we have on the basis of general exceptions, on the basis of security exceptions, but also by calibrating the commitments we take, for instance, as regards subsidies, to ensure that that space is not affected. And that is a very clear legal assessment that can be made. As compared to phase one agreement, look, I'm not gonna here start comparing CAI and phase one. They are very different. To start with, CAI, and I wanted to recall that point, is WTO compliant. We have clearly indicated and we have taken commitments that are covered by the GATS, and because we do not believe the scope of the CAI warrants a shielding from the MFN obligation, these are commitments that should be granted to all of the WTO members, including, by the way, the United States. The discourse, the rationale around phase one was very different. It was managed trade. It was an agreement to get China buying from the United States. The European Union took a very clear position, indicating that, in our view, it was not compatible with WTO commitments. So I'm not sure we need to compare that, but just to say, okay, those are phase one. It's still there. I don't think we have the impression that it will be renounced by the Biden administration. But in any event, neither CAI nor the phase one agreement are going to be a problem in terms of what we can do together. We even managed to have some degree of cooperation with the prior administration, for instance, on FDI screening or in possible work on post-technology transfer in the WTO. And we do have much, much greater expectations in terms of transatlantic cooperation vis-a-vis China with the new administration. Let me just say two things, which I think are important, not for me to state, but to have a reflection in another occasion, I assume. First, as regards decoupling, I have not heard yet any country or group of countries in the world of any important economic size stating that their objective is to decouple economically and fully from China. We do have a lot of discussions as to the intersection between trade and technology, the need to protect security, what needs to be done as regards specific areas and specific areas where we are in a very clear competition. That is a very valid and a very important discussion to be had, including between the European Union and the United States. And that's why, for instance, we have proposed to have a trade and technology council to channel all these discussions with the new administration. But you will not hear, at least I have not, a discussion about total decoupling from China. So that's a reality that needs to be taken into account, also because of the reality of the economies of our countries and the economic growth we're going to need in the months and years to come. And the second one, I come back to this, is rules. We do need autonomous measures. We need to protect our values, our internal market, and our security. But I do not think we are better off by pretending that China is not part of the trade multilateral system. They are a member of the WTO, remember? And I do not think we are better off if we think we can deal with our economic relationship with China without rules. And it's not only from an economic point of view, it's also for the values aspect. I do repeat, we have spent a third of our capital negotiation, you can count the pages, negotiating sustainable development with China. This is a huge effort that the European Union puts into precisely trying to inject those sustainability values in our trade and investment agreements, because they are related, because climate, labor are related to investment, are related to trade. So in that respect, you need to think as well. Do you think you are better off when you have as an objective improving, for instance, the labor situation in a particular country? You want to try to eradicate forced labor. Is it better just to think you're going to change that by outside pressure and unilateral measures when you are dealing with a country of the size of China? I think that is worth a discussion that goes a bit deeper as to what we can really do to really make a difference in our engagement with China.
Thank you very much. Conscious of time, so I'm going to turn to our three panelists, so Miguel, Justina and François, and I'm going to ask you the same question. If you were to advise the European Commission right now on the next phase, Miguel, you said this could be the start of a bigger negotiation, François and Justina cautioning and saying that actually it's a lot harder than that. What would be your advice to the European Commission? What should they be focusing on next with their relationships with China? Miguel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, just I saw as well kind of a question from me as well by Plamen, very quickly, really. I think, you know, is there a contradiction between saying, look, this is a lock-in of and this is more rules that we agree on with China, and on the other hand, China having more, you know, and keeping their kind of discretionality in decision making. Well, that's the tension between our system and their system, right? The tension of a system that is based on rule of law versus rule by law. And, you know, this tension will be there because we have different systems, right? Second point, you know, and this goes a bit to your Georgina's question here. Look, dual circulation will happen because of many reasons, because, you know, the United States will put more pressure, especially on telecommunications and technology, etc., to decouple from China. European business will be confronted with that, and dual circulation will happen in the sense. And so, my advice to the Commission of the businesses is: look, do dual circulation yourself. Try to be in China. Try to do as much business as you can with China according to the Chinese system, but don't rely on China. So yes to interdependence to some extent, but not to dependence. And so, you know, if you can diversify your value chains for the rest of the world outside China, do that immediately, because you might be, you know, exposed. And finally, a point on, you know, François' kind of, you know, I mean, look, what happened in the last 4 years in the United States has consequences. You have just to read Jonathan Kirshner's piece in Foreign Affairs, right? The Trump 4 years have shown us that the United States is not a reliable partner. And therefore, you know, we cannot wait for the United States in taking decisions. So we can cooperate, we can, you know, work together on many areas, and it will be done with or without CAI. But this notion that we have to kind of wait now for the United States to take a position so that we take a position, we just have different interests. And as I said, you know, the last 4 years cannot be forgotten. And therefore, you know, if you really believe in strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty or whatever you want to call it, then, you know, yes, Europe will have to take decisions that are autonomous.
Great, thank you, Miguel, for those 3 points. Justina, you've been waiting patiently. What would your advice be, particularly that you were quite harsh at the beginning, saying, you know, some member states weren't really included throughout the whole process, and the mandate was outdated. What would your tips be?
Well, first of all, do you hear me? Yeah, okay. First of all, a short remark about what Miguel has said about the United States and this strategic autonomy concept. I think that we are not talking about the waiting for, as Reinhard said in the first session, that waiting for some yes or okay from the Washington, but what the EU did with the CAI is the fact that we went against our own initiatives, that it was our initiative on the EU side to launch this transatlantic dialogue on China. Also, the EU published this agenda for transatlantic cooperation that was released in the 2nd of December, and then we decided to end the negotiations of CAI without any, let's say, cooperation or consultation with the US, not to have some imprimatur from the US, but to increase our leverage on China, I think. So this is the biggest, my biggest question mark about our, on the one, initiative to have this transatlantic dialogue with China, and then doing something completely opposite, even after this Sullivan's tweet asking us to consult, to cooperate, or to talk about this agreement with the new administration. And of course, we can talk about one phase deal that was agreed between the US and China without any consultation with the EU, and that there is a kind of problems with some negative aspects of this deal for us. But now we are after the elections, and we have a new president, and it was our let's say hope that maybe under Biden we can cooperate better with the US. And about the advice for the Commission what to do, I think that the most important issue for now is to make the EU more resilient. And of course, I really appreciate what the EU's China policy, the latest one, the sharpened course, that we decided to introduce some defensive measures and defensive mechanism. And I think it's really, really important that first of all, we should have the set of this defensive mechanism, that we should invest in our resilience. And then we should, let's say, negotiate with China on some kind of agreements that we should have some better enforcement, not about, we should not talk about Chinese will to do something, like in case of ILO conventions. To be honest, I don't know how to, it's 1-0 situation. China should ratify or not, but that there is a kind of expression that China should have some efforts to conclude, to ratify the agreements. And the last point, I think that now, because we are in the process of signing legal scrubbing, but also there's a discussion in the European Parliament should say yes or no. I think that we could use to some extent the European Parliament's leverage on China. For example, if China does not do something, that, for example, there is a kind of a threat that European Parliament will not endorse this agreement. So let's use the European Parliament and the fact that the European Parliament is pretty critical to have some to exert some pressure on Chinese side.
Thank you, Justina. Tips there for the Commission and the Parliament. I'm conscious we're over time, but I did want to give the final word to Francois. What would your advice be, Francois?
I think first for the EU, for Europeans to realize that this is a historical tragedy that's happening in and around China. We don't take a full measure of it. When we talk about, Donald Trump and 4 years of chaos, well, separation of power, rule of law prevailed. The United States is still standing and is still a free society with all its warts, all its defects. Even in Russia, I'm not going to please our Polish partner. We have the Navalny case, but Russia is a country where his video on Putin's palace can be downloaded 70 million times. It would not go beyond 100 times in China today. You cannot, from a distance, judge the totalitarian system that has reappeared, re-emerged, and that the top leader is fueling. This is a basic category mistake that we are making. And when I hear a lot of what Maria is saying, which reflects, in fact, a lot of, common thinking in the EU, it is still that, we will try, we will engage, we will get results, and so on, is the language of 30 or 35 years ago. In the commitment to join WTO, China had already committed to eliminating subsidies and the privileges of state enterprises, for example. It was there in the 15 articles. It took us 25 years to realize that most of these articles had not been followed through. The EU made a specific judgment, a category judgment about that. So I would say what the EU needs to do first, leverage the political opposition and the criticism from the value point of view, of human rights value that a lot of us are voicing, to try and get the Chinese to do a little better. I don't kid myself that they will eliminate forced labor, but there is no reason that we shouldn't try to get them to further commitments. I think we should always try for verification in any area that we sign with them, and that it's only the fear of losing an agreement that may get them to move. Not the notion, you know, that by talk and talk and talk, we would get to more results, because they are absolute experts at filibustering those talks, and everybody who's participated in that knows the attitude. Second, we do need to coordinate, not just with the US, not just because we follow the US, but with almost any partner that has some of these problems or shares some of these views with China. This is not the same as immediate and total decoupling, but it is clearly the need that we have to create alternatives, not to be dependent. We saw it about mask diplomacy in 2020. Some of the countries in Eastern Europe are already facing a vaccine diplomacy as well, and implicit threats, those who are interested in the Chinese vaccine, for example, and that's a good case. If the #1 in China, Mr. Xi Jinping, can ask the CEO of Starbucks, the American company, to use all his leverage to move the Biden administration, you can imagine what kind of implicit threat that is on a multinational company, and it's American. I am not surprised that European multinational companies present in China would know, of course, that they are partly hostage, that they need to escape reprisal and to sort of, you know, cling to any branch that might give them some safety, some legal safety and some perspective, some certainty. But those of us who are not hostages, who are not dependent on this market situation, should keep a cool head and see the Chinese system for what it has become again, I'm sorry to say. And this is a larger message than one that just concerns the CAI. I assure you that I've been for 30 years a proponent and an exponent of reform in China, and that for the past 15 years I've been an advocate of EU action, unity behind the EU, and pragmatism in that respect. But the conclusion I have arrived to is rather radical indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have been an abysmal chair because we are 8 minutes over, but I did want to give everyone an opportunity to come back and to respond to many of the comments and questions. My thanks to our excellent panel and to all of you very much for participating in this discussion. If you want to listen back or share this with your colleagues, there will be a recording available very soon that you can share. But until then, thank you very much, and let's continue this discussion.